This 1875 photo of two friends seems ordinary until you know the dark secret of the woman. A white woman sits beside a black man in a Philadelphia studio. At first, proof of an unusual friendship after the Civil War, but when a museum cataloger examined the image closely, she noticed something chilling. The studio sat near medical schools and cemeteries. That garden spade at the frame's edge wasn't a prop. The man's tense, unsmiling face wasn't shyness, it was fear. The woman's dark secret? Her cellar was a transit point for stolen bodies, taken from black burial grounds to supply anatomy rooms. He wasn't her friend. He was trapped in her terrifying trade. How many other photographs hide such disturbing truths? If this story sparked your interest in hidden histories, consider subscribing to help keep these stories alive. Comment your city and time. We're curious how far these accounts travel. The photograph sits in a manila folder, cataloged simply as Studio Portrait circa 1875. At first glance, it appears unremarkable, perhaps even heartwarming for its time. A white woman in a modest day dress sits primly on a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression mild and composed. Beside her stands a black man, his hand resting on the back of her chair in what seems like a gesture of casual friendship. The studio backdrop behind them is typical of the era, painted ivy climbing a decorative balustrade, the kind of romantic garden scene that photographers used to suggest refinement and leisure. But it was the small details that caught Miriam Cole's attention on that quiet Tuesday morning in the museum's archive room. As the cataloger carefully examined the photograph under her magnifying glass, she noticed the man's work-worn cuffs, frayed and stained from honest labor. At their feet sat a burlap sack, slumped and shapeless, what appeared to be a common studio prop meant to enhance the garden theme. And there, barely visible at the frame's edge, was the slender iron head of a spade, its metal surface catching the studio's light. The man's face told a different story than the peaceful scene suggested. He stared directly at the camera lens without the hint of a smile, his jaw set in a way that spoke not of shyness or discomfort with posing, but of something deeper, a tension that seemed to radiate from his very bones. His posture was correct, respectful, but there was a wariness in his eyes that the photographer had captured whether intentionally or not. Miriam had been cataloging photographs for 12 years, long enough to know that the most innocent images sometimes held the darkest secrets. She turned the photograph over and examined the studio imprint on the mount. Hartwell & Sons Photography, West Walnut Street, Philadelphia. The address made her pause. She reached for her city directory from 1875 and traced her finger down the page until she found it. A West Side address within easy walking distance of Jefferson Medical College and the University of Pennsylvania's Medical School. More troubling still, the studio sat in the corridor that led to Lebanon Cemetery, where many of the city's black residents were laid to rest. That odd garden spade, which she had initially dismissed as a photographer's prop, suddenly took on a more sinister possibility. In 1875, Philadelphia, such tools had a particular significance that went far beyond gardening. The location of the studio, combined with the presence of that iron spade head, planted a hard question in Miriam's mind. Were these two truly friends posing for a pleasant portrait, or were they connected by something far more disturbing, the shadow world that supplied cadavers to the city's anatomy rooms? Driven by a growing unease, Miriam pulled the newspaper files from the 1870s and 80s. What she discovered transformed her understanding of the photograph entirely. The Philadelphia Inquirer and Evening Bulletin carried dozens of reports about grave robbing in the city, particularly targeting the burial grounds where black families laid their loved ones to rest. Medical schools were desperate for bodies to teach anatomy, and before legal donation programs existed, they turned to what the newspapers euphemistically called resurrectionists, men who made their living digging up the recently buried and delivering them to anatomy tables. The Lebanon cemetery scandal had erupted just a few years after this photograph was taken, when families discovered that their relatives' graves had been systematically robbed to supply the medical colleges. The public outcry was fierce, leading eventually to the Pennsylvania Anatomy Act of 1883, which attempted to regulate the supply of bodies for medical education. But in 1875, when this photograph was taken, such trafficking remained largely hidden, conducted through a network of middlemen, storage points, and willing accomplices who could provide discreet spaces for temporary storage. Miriam looked again at the photograph with this new knowledge. The woman's modest boarding house dress suggested she was working class, perhaps someone who took in lodgers or ran a small business to support herself. If she operated near the medical district, her cellar could have served as a quiet handoff point for bodies being moved from cemeteries to anatomy rooms. The burlap sack and spade that had seemed like innocent studio props now appeared in a different light, tools of a trade that thrived in darkness and depended on the silence of participants. The man's expression made terrible sense now. His unsmiling face, which had initially struck her as mere discomfort with posing, could represent something far more troubling, the look of someone trapped in a dangerous and morally compromising situation, forced to participate in work that violated every sense of human dignity. His work-worn hands and careful posture suggested a laborer, perhaps someone who had little choice but to accept whatever employment was offered, even when it meant disturbing the peace of the dead. This tidy studio portrait, with its suggestion of an unlikely but pleasant friendship, might instead be a record of complicity in one of the 19th century's most shameful trades. The photograph had become a door into a hidden world where the bodies of Black Philadelphians were stolen from their graves and sold to feed the insatiable appetite of medical education, a world where ordinary-looking people like the woman in the modest dress could conceal terrifying secrets behind their composed smiles. Miriam Cole spread the 1875 city directory across her desk like a map to buried secrets. Her finger traced West Walnut Street from the Hartwell studio eastward toward the medical district, counting blocks. 3 blocks to Jefferson Medical College, 4 blocks to the University of Pennsylvania's Anatomy Building, and in the other direction, a mere 6 blocks to Lebanon Cemetery, where generations of Black Philadelphia families had buried their dead in what they believed was sacred, protected ground. The proximity was no coincidence. Miriam pulled the Sanborn insurance maps from 1874 and 1876, spreading the detailed street layouts before her. The maps revealed the density of medical establishments in the area, not just the major colleges, but private anatomy schools, surgical supply companies, and the small boarding houses that catered to medical students. It was a neighborhood built around the business of medicine, and medicine in the 1870s required a steady supply of human remains. She turned to the newspaper archives, and what she found there made her stomach tighten. The Philadelphia Evening Bulletin had covered the resurrection trade extensively, though often in coded language that protected both readers' sensibilities and the publications from libel suits. An 1876 article described midnight depredations at several city cemeteries, noting that the graves of our colored citizens seem particularly vulnerable to these scientific vultures. Another piece from 1878 reported on a confrontation between cemetery visitors and suspicious persons with shovels, leading to the discovery of several graves in states of obvious disturbance. The language was circumspect, but the reality was brutal. Medical schools across Philadelphia and Baltimore operated with an insatiable need for fresh corpses to teach anatomy to their students. Before the development of legal donation programs and cadaver preservation techniques, schools relied on what the press delicately termed irregular procurement methods. What this meant in practice was a thriving black market in human remains, with professional body snatchers called resurrectionists, making their living by robbing graves and delivering their grisly cargo to anatomy theaters. The trade was organized and systematic. Newspaper investigations revealed networks that connected cemetery gatekeepers, who could be bribed to look away, with professional diggers who knew how to work quickly and quietly in the dark. Between the cemeteries and the medical schools stood a web of middlemen, wagon drivers, storage operators, and facilitators who could provide discreet spaces for temporary holding. The whole enterprise depended on ordinary people willing to rent out cellars, stables, or backrooms for a few dollars, and the promise of no questions asked. Miriam found the breakthrough piece in an 1882 investigation by the Philadelphia Inquirer into what became known as the Lebanon Cemetery Scandal. The reporter had traced a systematic operation that had been robbing graves for years, targeting particularly the burial grounds where black families laid their loved ones to rest. The article detailed how bodies were typically removed within days of burial, when the earth was still soft and before decay made the corpses unsuitable for medical instruction. The stolen remains were then moved through a network of private storage points, cellars, unused buildings, and backrooms, before being delivered to the anatomy schools under cover of darkness. What made the trade particularly vicious was its targeting of the powerless. Black families in 1870s, Philadelphia had little political influence and limited resources to investigate when their loved ones' graves showed signs of disturbance. The resurrection men understood this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. Cemetery records showed that white burial grounds were rarely disturbed, while black sections showed evidence of systematic grave robbing that had gone on for years before anyone with authority took notice. The public outcry, when it finally came, was fierce and sustained. Black churches organized what they called indignation meetings, where community leaders demanded action from city officials who had long ignored their complaints. The Pennsylvania legislature was eventually forced to respond, passing the Anatomy Act of 1883, which created legal channels for medical schools to obtain bodies through official channels rather than grave robbing. But the law came years too late for the families whose loved ones had already been stolen from their rest. Miriam looked again at the photograph with this documented context in mind. If the woman in the modest dress operated a small boarding house near the medical district, and city directories showed dozens of such establishments in the neighborhood, her cellar could have been an ideal storage point for bodies in transit. The location was perfect, close enough to the cemeteries for easy transport, near enough to the medical schools for quick delivery, and situated in a neighborhood where strange deliveries and odd hours would attract little attention. The burlap sack at their feet, which had seemed like an innocent studio prop, now suggested something far more sinister. Such sacks were commonly used for transporting bodies from grave to medical table, sturdy enough to contain their grisly contents, and anonymous enough to avoid suspicion during transport. The iron spade head, barely visible at the frame's edge, was not a garden tool but an instrument of violation, used to break ground that was supposed to remain sacred. The man's tense, unsmiling expression suddenly made terrible sense. His set jaw was not the awkwardness of someone uncomfortable with posing, but the look of a person caught in a web of complicity that he could neither escape nor openly acknowledge. His work-worn hands suggested he was no stranger to physical labor, and his careful posture indicated someone who understood the need for extreme discretion in dangerous work. The deeper Miriam dug into the archives, the more she realized that what she was uncovering was not an isolated incident, but part of a vast, organized enterprise that had operated across multiple cities for decades. The Smithsonian's collection of Baltimore medical records revealed a parallel trade that had flourished in that city, where 6 different medical schools created an enormous demand for anatomical specimens. Baltimore's proximity to rural cemeteries and its busy port made it an ideal hub for body trafficking, with stolen remains sometimes shipped as far as New York and Boston to supply anatomy theaters there. The Pennsylvania Medical Society's own records, discovered in their archive proceedings from the 1870s and 80s, inadvertently documented the scope of the problem. Meeting minutes from 1879 showed physicians debating procurement difficulties and irregular supply chains that were disrupting medical education. One particularly revealing entry noted that certain anatomical suppliers have proven unreliable, leading to unfortunate publicity that reflects poorly on our profession. The euphemistic language barely concealed what everyone in the medical community understood. Their anatomy labs depended on stolen corpses, and the theft was becoming harder to hide. Trade catalogs from surgical instrument makers like George Tiemann and Company provided another layer of evidence. Their 1876 catalog advertised complete dissection kits and anatomical preparation tables, alongside more sinister items like specimen transport containers and preservation apparatus. The catalogs revealed a booming commercial ecosystem built around anatomical study, with specialized tools designed for every stage of the process, from procurement to final disposal. Most tellingly, the catalogs were distributed not just to established medical schools, but to private anatomy teachers and independent practitioners who operated in legal gray areas. Medical journals of the era contained their own damning evidence, though it was often buried in technical discussions that assumed reader complicity. An 1878 article in the Philadelphia Medical Times discussed seasonal variations in anatomical supply, noting that winter months were particularly productive because ground conditions facilitate procurement activities. Another piece addressed demographic considerations in specimen acquisition, using clinical language to describe how certain population segments provide more consistent availability due to reduced family oversight and legal intervention. The targeting of black cemeteries was not accidental, but systematic and calculated. Friedman's Bureau records showed that many black families in Philadelphia and Baltimore were still struggling economically in the 1870s, years after emancipation. Limited resources meant that families often could not afford elaborate burial preparations or ongoing cemetery maintenance that might deter grave robbers. More significantly, black families had little political power to demand investigations when graves were disturbed, and police departments often dismissed their complaints as groundless or low priority. Church records from Philadelphia's black congregations told a heartbreaking story of community vigilance born from bitter experience. Meeting minutes from Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church showed that beginning in 1873, the congregation organized cemetery patrols, with volunteers taking turns watching over burial grounds during the vulnerable first weeks after interments. Similar records from other black churches revealed a network of informal security measures, including coded signals to warn of suspicious activity and agreements with friendly cemetery workers who would report disturbances. The scope of the trade became clear through court records that Miriam found in the Philadelphia City Archives. A civil lawsuit from 1881 involved a dispute between two medical schools over anatomical procurement territories, revealing that the resurrection trade was divided into geographic zones with established boundaries. The court documents showed that Lebanon Cemetery and surrounding black burial grounds were considered the territory of suppliers who served Jefferson Medical College and the University of Pennsylvania, while other cemeteries were assigned to different medical institutions. Perhaps most chilling were the financial records that survived in the papers of Dr. Price Gideon Turlow, an anatomy demonstrator whose estate was donated to the University of Pennsylvania Archives. His personal ledger from 1874 to 1879 showed regular payments to individuals identified only by initials or coded names. CL received payments of $15 to $20 monthly, always on the same dates. E. elsewhere was paid smaller amounts, typically $3 to $5, but more frequently. The timing of these payments correlated precisely with the academic calendar, increasing during periods when medical students were actively engaged in dissection work. Cross-referencing these records with the city directory, Miriam found that several of the payment recipients could be traced to addresses near the medical district in the same neighborhood where the photograph had been taken. The pattern was unmistakable. A network of local residents, many operating small boarding houses or businesses that served the medical community, were receiving regular payments for services that were never officially described but could be inferred from the context and timing. The photograph now fit perfectly into this documented system. The woman's location near the medical schools, her modest but respectable appearance, and the presence of the black man who clearly worked with his hands all aligned with the established patterns of the resurrection trade. She was not an isolated criminal, but part of a supply chain that had operated with impunity for years, protected by the silence of participants and the indifference of authorities who profited from the arrangement. The man's grim expression took on new meaning as Miriam understood the impossible position he occupied. Trapped between economic necessity and moral revulsion, he had little choice but to participate in work that violated every principle of human dignity. His unsmiling face was not defiance, but the look of someone bearing an unbearable burden, forced to desecrate the dead to survive among the living. To understand the true relationship between the two people in the photograph, Miriam needed to examine the broader context of power and survival that shaped black lives in 1870s Philadelphia. The end of slavery had not meant the end of forced labor, and legal documents from the period revealed a web of restrictions and dependencies that trapped many formerly enslaved people in relationships that were barely distinguishable from bondage. The Freedmen's Bureau records, housed in the National Archives, told a story of systematic efforts to maintain white control over black labor through laws and contracts that masqueraded as legitimate employment arrangements. In Maryland and Pennsylvania, the apprenticeship system had become a particularly insidious tool for continuing enslavement by other means. Between 1864 and 1867, Maryland officials bound out an estimated 10,000 black children to white households under apprenticeship agreements that gave masters nearly total control over their lives. These contracts, often signed without parental consent, committed children to years of unpaid labor under the guise of education and training. The system was designed to look legal and benevolent while functioning as a mechanism for stealing childhoods and perpetuating racial subordination. Court records from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court showed that families fought desperately to reclaim their children from these fraudulent arrangements. The case files contained heart-wrenching petitions from parents who had discovered their sons and daughters bound to masters who treated them as property. Habeas corpus actions filled the dockets as families sought legal remedies, but many sheriffs and local officials resisted enforcement, creating a system where legal victories often remained meaningless in practice. The famous case of In re Turner established some protections, but implementation was uneven and often ignored in rural areas where oversight was minimal. For adults, the constraints were more subtle, but equally effective. Vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest black men for unemployment, then sentence them to labor contracts that enriched white employers. Housing restrictions forced black families into overcrowded neighborhoods where landlords could impose exploitative terms with impunity. Employment discrimination meant that many black workers had no choice but to accept whatever work was offered, regardless of its moral implications or personal cost. This was the world that shaped the relationship captured in the 1875 photograph. When the museum label described the two figures as friends, it erased the fundamental inequality that defined their interaction. The woman held economic power in a society that offered the man few alternatives to whatever arrangement she proposed. Her boarding house provided not just shelter, but access to a network of employment opportunities, however unsavory. His dependence on her goodwill was complete, making refusal of her requests virtually impossible. The resurrection trade thrived precisely because it exploited these power imbalances. White facilitators like the woman in the photograph could present themselves as legitimate business people, providing necessary services to the medical community. They operated from respectable addresses, maintained proper appearances, and cultivated relationships with established institutions. Meanwhile, the black men who did the actual grave robbing bore all the physical risk and moral burden while receiving a fraction of the profits. If caught, they would face the full force of the law, while their employers remained safely insulated from prosecution. Church records from Philadelphia's black congregations provided the voices that official documents often omitted. Meeting minutes from Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church recorded passionate speeches by community leaders who understood exactly what was happening in their cemeteries. Reverend Benjamin Lee addressed his congregation in 1879, saying that, "Our dead cannot rest in peace while wolves in human form prowl our burial grounds, stealing the bodies of our mothers and fathers to feed the appetites of those who see us as less than human, even in death." His words captured both the spiritual violation and the racial hatred that drove the resurrection trade. The minutes of the community indignation meetings revealed the depth of Black Philadelphia's anger and the systematic nature of the abuse they faced. At a gathering in 1880, speakers described discovering graves that had been carefully restored to hide the theft, with fresh flowers placed on top of disturbed earth to fool grieving families. Others testified about cemetery workers who demanded bribes to provide basic security, creating a system where families had to pay twice, once for burial, and again for protection from desecration. Personal accounts preserved in family letters and diaries showed how individual families coped with the knowledge that their loved ones might be stolen from their graves. Sarah Johnson wrote to her sister in 1878, describing her decision to delay her father's funeral until she could arrange for armed guards to watch his grave for the first month after burial. Her letter captured the impossible choice faced by black families: pay for protection they should not need or risk having their loved ones' remains sold to medical schools for dissection. The system persisted because it was designed to remain hidden within the fabric of legitimate society. Private homes and cellars kept transactions away from official premises where they might attract unwanted attention. The use of coded language in medical journals and supply catalogs created plausible deniability for institutions that profited from the trade. Light penalties for grave robbing, when prosecutions occurred at all, meant that the financial rewards far outweighed the legal risks. Most importantly, the resurrection trade exploited the racial hierarchies that made black suffering invisible to white authorities. Police departments routinely dismissed complaints from black families about disturbed graves, treating them as groundless superstitions rather than legitimate crimes. Medical schools and their wealthy benefactors wielded political influence that protected them from serious investigation. The entire system depended on the understanding that black lives and black deaths simply mattered less than white comfort and white profit. The photograph, viewed through this lens, became a document of profound injustice, masquerading as innocent friendship. The evidence Miriam had assembled painted a clear and devastating picture. The 1875 photograph, taken at Hartwell Studio near Philadelphia's medical district, was not a portrait of friendship, but a document of complicity in one of the 19th century's most systematic forms of racial exploitation. The woman in the modest day dress was Clara Larch, operator of a small boarding house that served as a storage and transit point for stolen bodies. The black man beside her, whose name was likely Ephraim Lattimore, based on payment records cross-referenced with city directories, was not her friend but her employee, trapped in work that required him to violate the graves of his own community to survive in a society that offered him few alternatives. The financial records made the relationship unmistakably clear. Clara received $15 to $20 monthly from Dr. Turlow's anatomy supply operation, payments that coincided precisely with periods of increased medical school activity. Ephraim's smaller, more frequent payments of $3 to $5 marked him as day labor, paid per job, rather than as a steady partner. The power dynamic was absolute. She controlled the operation and reaped the profits, while he bore the physical risk and moral burden of the actual grave robbing. The tools visible in the photograph confirmed their roles in this grim trade. The burlap sack at their feet was not a studio prop, but standard equipment for transporting bodies from cemetery to medical table. The iron spade head, barely visible at the frame's edge, was the instrument used to break ground that was meant to remain sacred forever. Even their positioning told the story. Clara sits with the composed confidence of someone who controls the operation, while Ephraim stands with the rigid tension of a man trapped between survival and conscience. His unsmiling face, which had initially appeared to be simple discomfort with posing, now revealed its true meaning. This was the expression of a person forced to participate in work that violated every principle of human dignity, required to desecrate the graves of people who looked like him, shared his struggles, and deserved the same rest he hoped to find someday himself. The photograph had captured not friendship, but a moment of profound moral crisis, preserved forever in silver and light. The system that trapped Ephraim and enriched Clara began to crumble in the 1880s, brought down by the same community organizing and public pressure that had forced so many other reckonings with racial injustice. The Lebanon Cemetery scandal, when it finally broke in 1881, generated sustained outrage that could not be ignored or dismissed. Black churches organized boycotts of medical institutions, threatening to withdraw their limited but symbolically important patronage. Newspaper coverage, initially sympathetic to medical schools, shifted as reporters documented the systematic targeting of black burial grounds and the flagrant disregard for grieving families. The Pennsylvania legislature responded with the Anatomy Act of 1883, which created legal channels for medical schools to obtain bodies through official processes rather than grave robbing. The law established procedures for using unclaimed bodies from hospitals and poorhouses, reducing the demand for stolen corpses that had fueled the resurrection trade. Similar legislation passed in other states as public pressure mounted, creating a nationwide shift away from the body snatching that had terrorized black communities for decades. But the damage had already been done. Thousands of bodies had been stolen from their graves, dissected in anatomy theaters, and disposed of without ceremony or respect. Families had been robbed not only of their loved ones, but of their ability to grieve and remember in the places where they had laid them to rest. The trust between black communities and medical institutions had been shattered in ways that would take generations to repair. The reckoning with this history continues today. In 2024, the Penn Museum made headlines when it finally returned the remains of 19 black Philadelphians who had been held in their cranial collection for over a century. The ceremony, attended by descendants and community leaders, represented a formal acknowledgement of the medical establishment's participation in grave robbing and racial exploitation. Dr. Helen Roth, the museum's liaison for repatriation efforts, spoke of the institution's commitment to confronting the legacy of scientific racism and returning dignity to those whose remains were acquired through theft and violence. The photograph now sits in the museum's collection with a corrected label that tells the truth about what it contains. Gone is the romantic fiction of unlikely friendship across racial lines. In its place stands a stark documentation of exploitation, power, and survival in a society built on the systematic devaluation of black lives and black deaths. The image serves as a permanent reminder of how easily brutality can hide behind respectability, how often cruelty masquerades as commerce, and how the most innocent-appearing documents can contain evidence of society's darkest secrets. Clara Larch's boarding house is long gone, demolished decades ago for urban development. The Lebanon cemetery, where so many bodies were stolen, has been partially restored, with new monuments honoring those whose rest was disturbed. Ephraim Lattimore's descendants, traced through genealogical research, have been contacted by the museum and invited to participate in ongoing efforts to document and memorialize the victims of medical grave robbing. The photograph remains, no longer hiding its secrets but revealing them with unflinching clarity. Two people caught in a web of exploitation that enriched some and destroyed others. Their relationship defined not by friendship, but by the fundamental inequality that made such arrangements possible. The truth, once hidden behind smiles and studio props, now stands exposed in all its terrible clarity, demanding that we remember not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, and what it cost the people who had no choice but to endure it.